Hi there, everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. I don't know if I want to call it the March edition, the Run edition, but it's certainly the Andrew Aydin edition. Andrew, thank you for jumping on and talking with me for a few minutes today.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It's good to be with you.
It is absolutely my pleasure. I think we just missed the publication anniversary of March. Um, that was a month or two ago. Is that right?
Yep, August 13th would be
Mm-hmm.
the 10-year anniversary of the publication of March Book One. Originally they were going to publish it on August 28th, I believe, because they were trying to correspond. They wanted it to go along with the March on Washington anniversary. 'Cause that would have been the 50th anniversary. And I I convinced the publisher to move it up a few weeks, which ended up being a good thing because we got so much attention out of San Diego that people were like, "Well, when is it on sale?"
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But I convinced him to move it up a few weeks because my 30th birthday was August 25th, and I had this. My mother could be like had very high expectations, right?
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And so you would do something like I got a job in Congress. I'm working for John Lewis, and she's like, cool.
Hmm.
And so I asked them, I got the congressman on board. I told him exactly why I was doing it. And they moved the publication date to August 13th because that was the last day because they always come out on a Tuesday. That was the last day that March could come out and be eligible for a New York Times bestseller list before I turned 30. And
Gotcha,
then,
gotcha.
it goes on to debut at number one on the New York Times bestseller list and comes out the day before my 30th birthday.
Uh-huh.
And so that was like purely for my mom of like, see, I'm a number one New York Times bestselling author in my 20s, and it was anyway.
What a gift for mom. Absolutely.
she Mama was a huge reader,
Hmm.
and books were just incredibly important to her. And I think in some ways she sort of begrudgingly accepted my love of comics and was glad I was reading, but it was definitely like, books were always around. She was that lady who would go to the library and you could get 10 you could do 10 holds per book, right? Like you put into your or 10 holds per library card.
Hmm.
And so my mother would have like a library card for her, a library card for me. If she could have had a library card for the dog, she would have. And then she just filled it up with as many, and then just, would request all these books and then just constantly had a stack beside her bed. And she was always reading in her free time. And so
Yeah.
she
Yeah.
was, she would pick out books that she thought I should read, and she would do whatever it took to get me to read them. Sometimes she'd say, this one's a little salacious, which is a nice way of saying what she said. But she always wanted me to be reading.
Yeah, yeah. I used to work at a public library. That was my job in college, and I was always amazed when families would come in and a child would pick up books, and a family member would go, "Oh, we're not checking out books today." It's like, what?
Yeah, like
What?
what are you doing there?
Yeah, what? Why are you here? Yeah, yeah. So March has certainly grown over the past decade. I mean, I remember discovering it. I was in a comics class in my doc program, and just the amazing breadth of what comics can do, first of all, but then also this amazing story of Congressman John Lewis, and definitely not a story that I'm able to read before bed. As I am with many comics. It's one of those that kind of gets me pumped up and emotional. So curious about anything that you would want to share about March and sort of how it's gained attention since hitting that New York Times bestseller list over 10 years ago now.
Yeah, I mean, well, the strange thing is that people forget how unlikely it was, or at least how many people perceived it to be unlikely to work,
Mm, mhm,
right? I mean, early on when I had the idea, and convince the congressman to do it, I spent years trying to convince publishers to publish it. And everybody said no, uh,
Mm-hmm.
until I found this little publisher with 4 people, including the warehouse guy. And there was no advance, there was no money. It was just, yeah, we'll give it a shot if you're willing to do all of this. And then, you back then, if you brought that up in Congress, folks would laugh at you.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It was, because the congressman and I ended up spending 5 years working on it, between trying to get it published, actually making the book. Nate came on board, I think, in 2000, really 2000, late 2011, early 2012.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so the congressman and I were kind of in the wilderness for almost 4 years, um, just trying to find a publishing house, trying to find a way to do this. I ended up writing what became book 1 on spec, like before we even had a publishing deal.
Mm-hmm.
And even in the ramp up, I think there was a lot of skepticism about whether or not it would be good,
Right,
you
right.
know, um, even in publishing, and once we were able to start showing pages, I remember going to the first San Diego Comic-Con, my first San Diego, in 2012, with an ash can, little 10-page black and white, basically on a computer printer version of some of the pages. And I mean, I was it was funny because you give it to somebody, you're like, it's gonna be big, I promise.
Right, right.
They're like, sure, yeah, okay. um and so you go through that phase, and then I think congressman and I were really good at getting free media,
Mm-hmm.
right? I mean, that was key in those early days. I had been both his campaign press secretary, and then later his campaign communications director. So sort of the idea of how you run a campaign from a press perspective was something I had a good deal of experience with at that point, and applied that in how we approached the launch of the first book. And so it was things like, we went to Book Expo first in May of 2013, and then we went to the American Library Association in June of 2013. I believe it was in Chicago. And saw, like, as we started talking about it, the interest grow. The librarians were really the first people to be like, oh, we need this. And we were very
Mm-hmm.
fortunate. We had this slightly larger, better, not quite computer printery version of the ash can to give out there, because we didn't have books yet. And then we go, it's actually, I remember when we were like the first time we went to the American Library Association before March came out, the congressman's in just like a regular hotel room, and not really a guest. We'd kind of wrangled our way into like a decent speaking slot, but not, this is the art, because it's like the John Lewis that we celebrate today
Mm-hmm.
is not the John Lewis that started this. It's not the
Mm-hmm.
John Lewis I first got to know in 2007 and 2008. It really revolutionized who he was. But I'll never forget then when all this stuff happened later, and March gets um, a bunch of awards and respect, and librarians really embrace this. They put Congressman Lewis in this hotel room that was bigger than anything I'd ever seen before in my whole life. And the congressman's in there, like, he's like, I don't know where it ends, he just keeps walking around. And we dubbed it the Mitt Romney suite, because we were like, only Mitt Romney could afford that. But that's where they put him, and
Mm-hmm.
but anyway, so then American Library Association goes well. The Shelby County decision was handed down, which kind of refocused people on both this history and the importance of voting rights.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think that contributed in some ways to people's interest in this subject in ways that they hadn't been interested in it before. And then the congressman and Nate and I really debut the very first copies of the book at the San Diego Comic-Con in 2013, and that was where it really exploded.
Mm-hmm.
Because the idea was, this was like a huge risk, and there were people in the congressional office who were just like, Congressman Lewis shouldn't be going to a comic convention, and you're like, all right, Square. Um,
Right.
like you're the one who got him in this mess. This is why people don't know about him. And he gets there. I remember, oh God, oh wow. The first night he got in there, they'd given away his hotel room because he got in so late.
Oh,
And
wow.
I just went nuts on the hotel guy being like, what are you gonna do to fix this? Like he
Right.
has to have somewhere to sleep. I'm imagining like I was already staying in a hotel room sharing it with several other people. So I'm imagining like John Lewis just bunking up with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
This at that point he was 73.
Right.
Like okay, Congressman back in the movement now.
Uh-huh.
And finally they found a hotel room in another hotel a little bit further away and put him up there. And um so we don't know how Comic Con's going to go, right? Like this is a huge risk because it's the first time a member of Congress has ever been to San Diego or any other comic convention, right? Especially with their
Mm-hmm.
own book. And this is, I can't emphasize enough. This was the stodgy days. This is before like nerd culture, comics, any of it was even remotely acceptable in Congress, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
I can
Mm-hmm.
remember because I get well known then because of it. There's all this media coverage and what happened later, but it would be like people would like basically have their like coming out moment to me where they'd be like, yo, dude, like I read comics too.
Right. Right.
Shh, like don't tell anybody, but they're all. And so I mean, I have this like tremendous fear that like this is gonna go poorly. And someone's gonna be an idiot or an asshole and just like just make it a mistake, but at the same time recognizing strategically like there is more press per square foot at the San Diego Comic-Con than any other place on earth that wants to talk about these sort of things.
Mm-hmm.
And being
Mm-hmm.
like, all right, this is how we get free press. It's shocking that John Lewis is going to go to this. It's innovative, it's new, it's different. Like, hopefully, we'll get what I'd seen happen in other places where you get this scrum where the press is like, oh, I got to cover this story.
Right. Right.
And I remember walking in on that Saturday morning of the San Diego Comic Con, and it's the Congressman and I and Nate and Lee from the publisher, and we're kind of nervous but excited, a little jittery, like going up. And then we get to the hallway, and then Congressman's like, "Oh, people are lining up early," like seeing these lines. And then by the time
Mm-hmm.
we get to the room, we realize that line was for him,
Yeah.
right? And
Yeah.
we weren't in like the biggest room. But the fact that we had filled it, that it was standing room only, because the buzz had grown about this book and that people wanted to see him. And it really just turned into this like emotional panel because people have been buying the book since Thursday, and that first book is only 120 pages. So like people had read it.
Mm-hmm.
They like almost every single person in that room had bought the book, read it, and was like, "Oh my God,
Right.
this is something I want to see. I want to be a part of this." And so, Congressman Lewis and I, we all give our talk on what this means and why we did it and the importance of it. And I remember I had I asked, I was like, how many of you guys watch Battlestar Galactica? Like, I was like, because I gave this like history lesson about like Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story and how it was used to inspire some of the earliest acts of civil disobedience to the movement,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
and then followed it up with my Battlestar, like, all of this has happened before and all of this will happen again. And here
Right.
we are using Dr. King's idea on a much larger scale at a time when comics are becoming much more acceptable and useful in the classroom to try and essentially start a new nonviolent revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And the congressman, like, I mean, I remember when I said that he had this like look on his face, like, I don't know what the boy is talking about. And then like everybody's like, yeah, watch it, Battlestar course, and I'm like looking over at him. There's actually a photo of it where I give him this like look, and he's got this kind of, all right, you know. And it just, I mean, it was just rowdy. And like during the question and answer session, like teachers and people were coming up and they like couldn't get their question out because they were crying. They're like, it's just so emotional to be here. And the guys were like, oh man, this might work, right? And
Mhm.
so then we go and we go to do a signing at the booth, which you got to remember, like in those days, this is when Top Shelf was still an independent publisher, and it had this little booth that they made into a rectangle that had that was along the middle corridor at San Diego, and the line for the signing stretched all the way down the convention hall. And the
Wow.
fire marshal came and was like, I'm sorry, gentlemen, but you have to cut the line. And the congressman was like, he was like really upset, like not mad but he like didn't want anybody not to get their book. So he was like, I'll sign again later. Like we'll do another one. But he sat and we signed books at that first signing for, gosh, almost 3.5, maybe 4 hours
Wow.
just to get through the line. And the press is coming up and we're having to take breaks to do interviews for the local news stations, who were then feeding that out. But we're in this bubble, right? Because we're just signing, so we're not seeing any of the news stories getting fed out and going everywhere, and all the online. I mean, I don't have time to even check my phone, right? Because it's like
Right.
I'm doing double duty because I'm staffing John Lewis and being the author of this book.
Hmm.
And so we go through that day and it's just wild and it's emotional and it's all these things. And at the end of it, I was like, Congressman, what do you want to do to celebrate? And he's like, I saw that there was a Nordstrom's in because I mean, that man, he loved a good department store.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And because he used to do that, his wife had passed away New Year's Eve 2012 going into 2013, right?
Uh-huh.
And so that used to be something they would do together, just go and pick through and maybe pick out a tie because he always needed new ties because he was always having to wear a suit and he was always on camera, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And so I was like, all right, well, we're gonna go. And so we're walking. And remember, he doesn't, this is at a time when he walked from the San Diego Convention Center to Nordstrom's, which is almost a mile into the city. And he did not get recognized once, which almost
Wow.
seems unimaginable now, right? But this
Hmm.
is what it set off. And so we cross the street, we cross past the train tracks where the San Diego trolley kind of runs. And I finally check my phone and I look up the sales rank on because I was seeing, oh my God, there's a lot of coverage. And then I was like, oh, I wonder how the book's doing. And so I checked the sales rank on Amazon and it had cracked the top 100 books. And
Wow.
I screamed and like threw my phone. Like it was like, I didn't know how to react to this. I was like, I couldn't believe it. And the congressman was like, what is wrong with you? And I'll never forget what I said. Because I was raised by a single mother. We hustled every day of our lives. I was on scholarship since the fourth grade, and I was now working, making $37,000 a year as a congressional staffer.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
And I said to the congressman, I'm not going to be poor anymore. Right? I mean, I was literally
Hmm.
living below the poverty line at that point. Right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And just this idea that I would make any kind of money. And like my mother was getting sick, and I was taking care of her with what I had to spare, and all these sort of things that emotion just overwhelmed me that it was like, okay, this had worked. And my first thought was like, not, oh, am I going to win an award? Oh, am I going to be famous? Oh, am I going to be any of these things? Mine was like, I don't have to live in poverty anymore.
Hmm. Hmm.
Right, which I think we lose sight of sometimes when we're talking about like the creators in this industry and what they're working for.
Yeah.
Like where they're coming from and what they're trying to do. They're not trying to get rich or famous. They're trying to be able to just not live in poverty,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? Um So we keep walking and we go to the Nordstrom's and we're poking around. And the congressman sees us on the TV that they have on the local news. And he's like, look,
Hmm.
it's us, you know? And it's like kind of this exciting moment. And then one of the guys who's like working the register goes, hey, aren't you that congressman with a comic book? Oh yeah, you're that comic book staffer. And he recognizes us, right? And
Hmm.
the congressman was like, I've done a lot of things in my life. I didn't think that would be why I would be recognized.
Right,
You know?
right.
Hang on just one second.
Yes, yeah, sure.
Sorry, the dog got in the trash.
Oh, no
Uh,
worries at all.
yeah. Um, so San Diego becomes this huge success in that we got all this free media out of it, and it gets broadcast on all the local news stations around the country. I mean, just you know how they do a news package and it gets syndicated out, and it was just huge, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then there's this like wait because San Diego ends July, I think it was 22nd, 23rd that year. And the book doesn't come out for 3 or 4 more weeks. So the congressman and I, we just go back to Washington and we're working we're back in Congress, and I'm like sitting there, tweet, 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 like,
Hmm.
um, and life kind of like you kind of forget about it a little bit. Um, and then we go to just the weekend before it comes out. Congressman and I go to the American Library Association's Black Caucus convention in um, Covington, Kentucky, which is just on the other side of the river from Cincinnati.
Hmm.
But it's got a symbolic importance because this was like the crossing of the Underground Railroad from slave territory into free territory, right?
Yeah, yeah.
And this was where like it really kind of took hold. Like we thought we were doing well, San Diego, everybody loved it, you get all this attention, but the potential, I don't know, like just there was something different about what happened there because we go and we do our talk and we're getting better at what we wanted to say. We
Hmm.
all sang "We Shall Overcome" with the crossed arms. um and then we have a book signing afterwards, and we'd only like I brought the books in my luggage, right?
Hmm.
And I was worried about how many I would have left, right? That I would have to ship back and like what we would do. And so we do this signing, and like the first lady's taking like 6, 8 copies, the next lady's taking like 10 copies. All of a sudden we realize there's only, if they keep doing this, there's only enough books for like the first 15 people in line.
Right,
And there's
right.
like 100 people in line. And there's this wonderful librarian who worked at the University of Louisville, um, who just regulated. I mean, absolutely just tells everybody what's what. One per person, give me that book back, like, and just redistributes them all. And the congressman and I are just like, we've never seen such like fervor. And so then we go to the airport because the congressman had to go back to Washington for something, and then he was going to fly up when I was going to meet him in New York, but I went to New York a day early so that I could be there and prepared because then we were going to do Colbert and a book signing.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when we get to New York, that was really where it started to get surreal because like, I'd never been to something like Colbert. And this was when it was the Colbert Report, right?
Yes,
So there's like a little bit of like, how's he gonna react?
the satire of it. Yeah.
Yeah. And so his first question is it dignified for a congressman to write a comic book? And like shit, like but it was a great way to open it.
Hmm.
Because then the congressman goes, well, actually, a young member of my staff. And then they put Martin Luther King and the Montgomery story up there. He talks about my graduate thesis, and he's like, Martin Luther King used a comic. Now I'm using a comic. And Colbert's like comes like does the whole dramatic arc of like, wow, this actually does seem like a good idea. Maybe it'll work. If only we had a conservative comic book, which actually they went and made later. No one bought it. Um
Uh-huh.
they timed it actually. Each successive book they had like Chuck Dixon write a new one, and it was just No one's ever heard of them since.
Wow, wow.
But so we go through all that, and then we go back to Washington again, right? And like I remember it was August recess, but we were in the office for some reason. I don't remember exactly what it was. And we got a phone call from the publisher, and he said, "I have some news. Can you put the congressman on with you?" And so I put it on speakerphone, and he says, "Congratulations, March Book One is going to debut at #1 on the New York Times bestseller list." And the congressman just starts crying.
Mm.
And then he grabs me and he hugs me. And I'm a good bit taller than John Lewis was. So his face goes right into my chest. And I had on a white shirt and a tie. And the congressman had just done an interview for something. I think it was around the 50th anniversary of the March on Washington. So he had a full face of makeup on.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so he makes this John Lewis face mush on my shirt and he pulls back and it's like the Shroud of Turin with his face. And he gets so embarrassed. And I remember being like, guys, I don't care about the shirt. We did it.
Uh-huh. Uh-huh.
But the thing that people forget is that all died down pretty quick.
Right.
And the congressman and I had to start working essentially a circuit of churches, like going to church, like basically doing like speeches in church basements, like with the
Hmm.
congregation or with people who would come. And just, I mean, I would keep boxes of the books in the back of my car because sometimes the congressman would say, "Hey, tonight we could do a signing at this event. They said they'd like us to do it. Will you come, bring the books, and I want you to say a few words with me about why we're doing it." And we hustled. I mean, we hustled for the next really like 3 years doing that sort of stuff
Hmm.
wherever we could. Like going to social studies conventions, going to library association conventions, going to schools where they would have us. I mean, I remember one time we actually went to the school where John Roberts' son was going and didn't know it at the time, but he came up after our talk and he said, to the congressman, he said, "I really enjoyed your book." And they said, "You might know my father. My father's John Roberts." And the
Mm-hmm.
congressman, this is really fresh after Shelby, says, "Well, why don't you make like I hope your father will read the book too."
Hmm.
And I was like, "Yeah, gee, John Lewis, man, like really, the kid's in like middle school." Um, but it was work. I mean, we set up our own events. We did this. We must have done between 2013 and 2016 with the winning when we won the National Book Award. We probably did 500 events
Wow.
easily,
Wow. Yeah.
just telling the story because that's how Jim Lawson did it, right? That was what I wrote about in my graduate thesis, that it wasn't enough to just produce the comic book. You had to go on the road and you had to do the as a kind of say, you had to spread the gospel,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And you had to explain why it was relevant, draw that personal connection, do these things so that people then would have the book and the inspiration, and then they would read the books, and then it would make for that moment. Um, and so it was intense doing that, and then that fall, the congressman did an event at the Kentucky Author Forum in Louisville, and Rachel Maddow introduced or did the interview. And I remember I didn't watch the interview. I hung out with her dad backstage. I was like, this guy's cool. And we just talked for like 2 hours. And then it was
Hmm.
over. And like, that was it. Right. And so I was like, cool. Well, I got to meet Rachel Maddow. She's great. Like, I hope the interview went well because they recorded it and they were going to put it on public broadcasting. And then a few weeks later, she was actually like invited all of us onto her show. And I was so scared, man. Like the Rachel
Right.
Maddow show, like, come on. I'm 29, just barely 30 years old.
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
I don't have a suit that really fits. Like, I don't know how to cut my hair because I've been cutting it myself for all this stuff. And I remember doing that. And then after that, things really changed because that was when March hit like number 2 or number 3 on Amazon of all the books. She
Hmm.
did this,
Hmm.
her team did this unbelievable package, like showing how like they took the audio from the actual events and showed how we were quoting, right? Like she showed that this was because we had trouble explaining to people this isn't historical fiction, this is nonfiction, which was totally
Hmm.
different because it was in the moment, right? And nobody had
Hmm.
done that kind of research to build a book,
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
graphic novel that way, because it's a different kind of even nonfiction research in that context. And it exploded. And I remember sitting in that hotel lobby. I think we were staying at like a courtyard near Times Square. Not a fancy hotel by any means, but we were just sitting down there in the lobby afterwards, just kind of stunned because now we're seeing the reaction in real time on social media.
Yeah.
Um, the sales, the people wanting like, okay, when's the next one? Like, and we had just felt like we just finished this marathon just to finish the first one.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, anyway, that brings us up to November of 2013. So I just spent a lot of time telling you about a very brief period of time.
But it's a epic time, and I mean it's since become a trilogy. It was a trilogy, and now you're working on Run. The first book of Run has come out, so I imagine you're pressing it for kind of the next steps in the story as well.
Yeah, I don't know if I'm gonna finish that one, man.
Yeah, yeah.
It was like the part that we don't talk about is how hard it was to do those books.
Hmm. Hmm.
And it was hard on many levels. Um, it was hard both like just logistically, like to just pull off that level of research,
Yeah,
right? Because you're not just saying who said what, it's who's in the room, what did they look like, what were they wearing, what did the room look like,
yeah,
what
yeah.
cars were they driving, what did the trees look like all this sort of stuff. And then there was also a part of it where there was that constant nagging question that you would get from some of the folks who weren't always happy that it was working. And sometimes I wondered if this was just because they didn't like the idea of nonviolence being
Mm-hmm.
at the forefront. But there would be, questions about like why did he do this with a Turkish kid? Right? Why didn't he do this with a black kid?
Hmm. Hmm.
And then all sorts of things too about like there is still beef among the members of the movement all these years later.
Yeah,
And you get wrapped up in all of that, and all you're like is like, look, I'm just trying to teach people about how you saved yourselves so that they
right.
can save themselves. Congressman Lewis and I wanted to make Run because we saw a generation of public servants who had in many ways let down the people they were supposed to be serving.
Hmm.
The
Hmm.
congressman would say there are these people that he worked with who love the world, but that they didn't love people. And so I think in many ways, you know, after March had done all the things that it did and continues to do, there was this feeling that if we left the story with the signing of the Voting Rights Act, we would create a false sense of finality.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when you really get into the history, you see that the pushback to the Voting Rights Act started immediately. That's why Run was so important. We forget that the Watts uprising was just a few weeks after the signing of the Voting Rights Act. We forget that John Lewis ended up in prison 2 days after the signing of the Voting Rights Act down in Americus, Georgia, where the Klan led their largest hooded march in decades. And we see this emergence of the forces of white supremacy using the tactics of the movement against them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And there were so many other things that were similar to what was happening right in front of us that we felt like we needed to tell the story. I mean, I always think about, Julian Bond um, not being seated at the Georgia General Assembly. And even though Congressman Lewis didn't live to see it, it was so similar to what happened to the three legislators in Tennessee.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And there were these lessons that we had to put down on paper because this period of time hasn't really been written about. That was one of the things that I encountered in doing the research for the book that was so difficult, is that, you know, that year between August of 65 and September of 66 kind of gets moved through very quickly. And you don't look at how um, many of the things that happened still impact our lives today.
Mm-hmm.
And also, you know, the story to me, as I envisioned it, was the story of these two men, John Lewis and Julian Bond, who who were incredibly close, incredibly good friends, and then became um, kind of bitter enemies.
Yeah.
But to me, like, I was at the juncture between their coming back together before Julian passed. Um, I remember in 2014, the congressman and I got invited to go to the LBJ Presidential Library at the University of Texas, Austin, and participate in the the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
Mm-hmm.
And they had a summit, and they wanted us to do a book signing because this little comic book was getting a lot of attention. And so the congressman, they wanted to be there, but they wanted me to be there too, so we could talk about that too, because you know the young people needed something.
Right.
Um, and so I remember being in the room. I think it was one of the first times. I think it was the first time John Lewis and Julian Bond had ever agreed since the '86 election to do an event together, and no one knew really how it would go. And so we're in the green room, and it's this wild place, right? Where I'm sort of like, what am I doing here, right? I'm 31 by this point. No,
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
30. I hadn't even turned 31. And Bill Clinton's in the room, Vernon Jordan, Andy Young, Mavis Staples, John Lewis, Julian Bond, all these folks. And you know, they're making chit chat, and then Julian just walks across the room and comes up to me. And I'm like, uh-oh, what did I do? You know? And he just very matter of factly, in that very deep voice, says, you know, I wrote a comic book first. I was like, oh shit, you know? Like, yeah, I'm
The
aware you did a
challenge is
comic,
on.
right? I was like, yeah, the comic about Vietnam.
Mm-hmm.
And I get really excited. And so all of a sudden, here I am in this room talking to Julian Bond about his comic book. And I was like, can I actually ask you questions about this? Because you know, I wrote about the other. He's like, I read your research. I was like, oh, cool, you know. Um, and so you know, we exchanged phone numbers and emails, and I and then you know, they go on to do this panel together, and they're very friendly.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
But somehow Julian never got John Lewis's number, or maybe he didn't want it. I'm not sure, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And so I kept emailing with Julian about comics, and like, you know, he always promised me he would give me a copy. And like, this is an incredibly rare comic, you know? So I was always like, yeah, man, hook me up, you know?
Right. Right.
And he it got where he would call me and he would say, I'm going to call you again. Don't pick up. I want to leave a message for the chairman, because that's what he still called him after all this time. He was the chairman, right? I think the
Right.
arc of life had come back around where like no longer were they thinking about the 80s or the 90s. It was like he was thinking about Snake. And so he would call me, and then I wouldn't pick up, and he would leave a message. And I remember the one I remember most distinctly was his birthday.
Mm-hmm.
And he left him this birthday message, and it was just, Mr. Chairman, I'm just calling to wish you a happy birthday. You know, like, and so getting to be in that space between these two figures that I'd written about and written with, um, I started, you know, really conceptualizing Run as the story of John Lewis's transition to from activist to public servant, right? So first you march, then you run.
Hmm. Hmm.
Well, also it was the story of these two men and the dominance that their relationship had over the black political establishment in the South.
Hmm.
Because Julian, because he gets famous, he gets famous because of the refusal to seat him, right? We've seen this exact thing happen now
Hmm.
with the Tennessee state legislators. And so then, later he runs for the state Senate. He gets nominated for the vice presidency in 1968 at the convention. And if you look at the footage, it's John Lewis standing right next to him when he's recognized,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
And even though he was too young to actually accept it, I mean, that's how prominent he became. And also, I mean, like, not to get into the nuts and bolts, but it was actually like John Lewis who wrote the letter that got encouraging Julian to run for Congress. I think it was
Hmm.
1970 or 72. I think he wrote it in 70 and it was for the 72 election for the 5th district seat and outlined this whole plan about how it could be this the most prominent seat of black leadership in the South.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
Julian says, "No, I'm not going to do it." And then Andy Young gets a copy of the letter and he decides to do it. And that's how Andy Young becomes a congressman. And then John Lewis runs for Congress in 77 when Weish Fowler, against Weish Fowler. This is another random story, but I saw Weish at Max Cleland's funeral service. And he leans into me and he goes, I'm the only person who ever beat John Lewis in an election. And I said, well, except Stokely Carmichael. And it was just like, his wife is a really nice guy, and I was just surprised to see him. And
Hmm. Hmm.
it was it's so funny how they like hold on to these things,
Right, right.
But anyway, so the series was going to go all the way to the 86 election, and I'd done a lot of research about that because it was so consequential, but it's also this David versus Goliath story. I mean,
Hmm.
Julian had the entire black political establishment behind him, and John Lewis just chipped away and then worked his way into the runoff. And then I've gotten to know several of the people who participated in that campaign over the years. And um, I guess the thing is like the joy of it came from showing John Lewis my work and then
Yeah.
experiencing the success of it with him
Hmm. Hmm.
and doing that without him, like being on the road. I do a lot of speeches now. I'm gonna actually speak at a school not too far from you, probably next fall once that's announced.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, I spoke at Virginia Tech just last month, and I go and I tell the stories. I talk about my life and the congressman's life and the work I've done, and I sort of have that responsibility to bear witness, much in the same way that he did, because I'm one of the few people who, like, now that they're passing away, their memories are and who they really were, like behind the scenes when the cameras are off,
Hmm.
it's
Yeah.
gonna it's gonna go away. And so somebody has to talk about that because otherwise then they get turned into some sort of like corporate sponsored entity.
Right, right. Or
And we see that
caricature.
happen. Was that?
Or caricature
Yeah,
somewhere.
exactly. They get Disneyfied.
Right.
Um and so I do that, but when you're on the road like that and it's just by yourself, there's that. It's just lonely. It's hard, especially when so much of my life and doing that um, was to make him be recognized the way I felt he should be,
Hmm.
which we largely succeeded at. Also, this team. I mean, like, think about it. Like, the congressman and I set out in 2013 to start a new nonviolent revolution. By 2019, March is one of, if not the most widely taught graphic novel in America, and one of, if not the most widely taught texts or works about the civil rights movement.
Hmm.
What
Hmm.
do we see in 2020, right? I mean, these kids, these young people, that's where the uprising comes from. I remember
Hmm.
in when the congressman went to Black Lives Matter Plaza in May of 2020, as all of this is happening, he called me, and first he said, it looks just like the cover of March Book 3.
Hmm.
Because it did, right? Like,
Right.
written down the road like that, just like we did with Highway 80 on the cover. And then he says, this is the March generation. They're on the move now.
Hmm.
And then immediately after that, what do we start seeing? All of these book bans and attacks on curriculums. Like, they
Right.
know what's happening. They know what worked. And so they'll go after genderqueer, or they'll go after To Kill a Mockingbird.
Hmm.
But really,
Hmm.
they're all dancing around the fact that we put nonviolent civil disobedience into American schools in a way that it had never been put before. And that's
Right.
what they're afraid of. This generation learning how to organize, learning how to disrupt a corrupt system,
Hmm.
that is stacked against not just people of color, but people who do not come from means, right? Because the
Hmm.
question became, after the end of what the congressman would say was the movement, it was about not just, can I go to the restaurant, but can I earn $1 so that I can afford to pay for the food at the restaurant, right? There's this
Right.
question we ask in Run: was America ready to share its bounty? Right? And
Hmm.
that fundamentally is what this is about. All of these tools, all of these tactics, the division, the manipulation, the anger that's manufactured, it's all about keeping people from recognizing that their pockets are getting picked every day,
Hmm.
that they're not given a fair shot, that their labor isn't rewarded fairly. And I guess that's the thing too, where it's like, now that I'm out of professional politics, like, at least in the way that I was, understanding that both parties have been complicit in this.
Right. Right.
And sure, the Republicans have largely been influenced by foreign powers like Russia and China, and that they're being used to disrupt the very basic fundamental purposes of government. But it's impossible to say that there weren't elements, especially starting after like 90 and 92, when Bill Gray and others started soliciting campaign donations um, from corporations, that we became complicit in the same thing.
Hmm.
And you see that even in March, with the tension between LBJ and his Texas supporters and his folks, that his cabinet and his stakeholders, and his relationship with Richard Russell, that they were only willing to give the movement so much,
Hmm.
even when they gave them something. It's the 1964 uh, Civil Rights Act completely leaving out any meaningful reforms for voting rights. And then when the leaders of the movement go to LBJ and say, we need voting rights, him saying, well, if you want it, make me do it. Right?
Right.
Like
Right.
it's that they have to keep pushing for it, and no one's going to give you a fair playing field unless you make them.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I think in some ways too, that was what Run was going to be about. Was like, okay, well, this is how they made them do it. They tried and
Hmm.
had to navigate that system, right? And ultimately, it was Julian's failure to navigate that system with a pure heart that allowed John Lewis to beat him in '86. So I guess the thing is, I lost my mother, I lost my grandmother,
Hmm.
both within 8 weeks of each other in 2017, essentially 6 months after we won the National Book Award.
Right.
And then, and I should have probably walked away then, because I was broken. But I tried to stick it out and stay with the congressman and stay in the office and keep fighting. And what March had become was so dangerous to the status quo that the people who needed to get their, like, who wanted to be bought off, or who felt threatened by it, or who wanted just to be the guy that John Lewis was bringing up on stage instead of me,
Hmm. Hmm.
it became just toxic. I mean, just brutal. But I couldn't leave him, like
Yeah. Yeah.
he would say I was like a son to him, and I said often that he was like a father to me. And so I stayed until
Hmm.
he passed. And then I walked away. I didn't apply for a job with another office. It seems like everybody was just dying to like be like, "Oh, you feel sorry for me. My boss died. Can I have a promotion?"
Right. Right.
And I didn't want to. I couldn't do that. I just wasn't. My heart wasn't there. And so I moved back to my mother's farm, which is down the street from where my grandmother lived. My grandfather was a mailman here in Edneyville, for a
Hmm.
long, long time. And I bought a tractor, started a garden, started growing things,
Yeah.
and I started writing Batman and things like that. Like I just did what I needed to do to heal. And
Yeah.
I think now the big question for me is that, all right, I know now how to elevate a story. I
Hmm.
know how to use comics to bring someone of value to a national audience who might not otherwise have that opportunity.
Hmm. Hmm.
And so the question to me has been, how do I use that?
Yeah.
And so I've been working on a new book for the last couple years, and I'm hoping we'll be able to announce something before too long.
Good.
Probably won't be
Good.
out till 2026 because they take a lot of work. I don't think people
Yeah.
understand how much work a nonfiction graphic novel takes because it's totally different than anything else that you could do.
Hmm. Hmm. You
Both
have the
for
research, the writing, yep, all the things.
the layouts. I mean, I could do an hour on the importance of lettering and layouts in a
Hmm.
nonfiction comic before we ever talk about any of that other stuff. Like that's
Hmm.
one of the things Nate Powell doesn't get credit for, and absolutely should, because you don't notice it unless it's bad. But his lettering, the way in which he uses the words in March is as powerful and as important as the art itself.
Hmm.
Um, the congressman and I would call it the voice of God. And so I'm working on that. And I've been doing other things. I've been making comics for New York City Department of Ed about civics, teaching kids. Did
Hmm.
one on the 15th Amendment, just finished it. And I'd done one before that on the 26th Amendment, which is why 18-year-olds have the right to vote. Um, and I've been helping other people. I've been helping sort of the local folks in Western North Carolina organize the party. There's a lot of work that can be done there. I've been helping down in the Georgia Senate, helping out there with because well, that's a whole nother conversation. But
Right.
the
Right.
state legislatures right now, man, they need all the help they can get.
Yeah, I'm sure. I'm sure.
So I don't know. I guess all I can say in the end is first, like, thank you for teaching.
Well,
Um,
absolutely.
Lord knows
Absolutely.
we need more good people in the classroom. And I think about this a lot in the context of Congressman Lewis's life, right? He he was the center of the world. He was on the cover of Life magazine in 1965. And by 1968, he had lost his mentor. He had lost his boss.
Hmm.
Um, he, in some ways, lost everything and was forced to rebuild his life. And so I don't, I don't feel sorry for myself and what I went through, and I don't. In many ways, I almost think it's inevitable when you do something truly extraordinary. Because when you really think about it, March is the first and only comics work ever to win a major literary award in competition. Spiegelman never won an award in competition, not a major. The Pulitzer was a special citation after the fact. The
Hmm.
National Book Award, another special citation. Um, Never. And no one else ever did either. So, in a sense, we broke literature, right?
Hmm.
Like,
Hmm.
and we
It's a
did
big
it,
ceiling.
yeah, with a comic that no one understood how we made.
Hmm.
That's been the thing that I've always been surprised by. People are like, well, didn't you just write down what John Lewis told you? And it's like, no. And you're a moron if you think that.
It's a
Like, you're
different
a
process.
big, dumb dummy head, right? Like, you're just an idiot if you really think that. And literature itself is perhaps the most sacred art to our society because it is the way we preserve ourselves.
Hmm.
An
Hmm.
image does not preserve a personality,
Hmm.
it gives us a window, a snapshot. And then to be able to use images and words, we created something that will live on far beyond us.
Hmm.
And that will inevitably break anyone,
Hmm.
that moment. And the question is, how do you pick up the pieces? How do you rebuild yourself?
Right.
And I think about it, before my mother passed, we got all these medals, right? Because you get a medal for the National Book Award, you get a medal for some of the ALA awards. And my mother, she asked me, she said, now you have more than one medal. Can I have one? I was like, yeah, mom, of course. So I gave her my National Book Award medal.
Hmm. Hmm.
And when my mom passed, I was back in town. I took care of her when she got sick and then cleaned everything up afterwards. And I started hearing these stories from the grocery store people or the gas station people or the neighbors. And I would say, I'm Lynn Van Buren's son. And they would say, oh, yeah, I saw her. She was wearing a medal the last time I saw her. And
Yeah.
I was like, what do you mean? She's like, yeah, this big old, I think one of them said Flava Flav looking medal, which it was. Um, and mom was going to the grocery store. She was weeding the front yard in her bathrobe, all while wearing this medal.
Hmm.
And I guess that's the other thing is she got it. She sacrificed so much. I mean, a single mom, an immigrant husband who left, like raising me was not easy.
Hmm.
And she got to prove to herself and to everyone else that she raised an extraordinary child
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
doing the thing that she loved most. You know what I mean? Like I think if I'd made $1 billion, my mother would not have been happier. You know,
Yeah.
um, because it was books, and I think that's the thing. Like at the end of the day, and you look back on your life and know that what you did made the people that you care about most happy.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I know that what I did both did that and also made many people that I will never know more free
Yeah.
and more able to live a fair and equitable life. And I did it with something that I loved.
Hmm.
And I just hope that the lessons taken is that, especially among young people, you see the future. Like you
Yeah.
have this clairvoyance because you make the future.
Hmm. Hmm.
Embrace those things that you love, even if the adults don't get it at the time, because that's your way out. That's how you cross over. That's how you become free. That's how you do something extraordinary.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Love it. Love it. Yeah.
Thanks, man.
Yeah. Well, much love for the books, much love for the story, and thanks for sharing the journey as well. I know it's been one of joy and grief and healing, and I mean, coming up to 2020 and 2021, uh, it was almost like I think the whole world was breaking um, with that story and with the changes that were going on in your life too. So, um,
Yeah, and that's a strange thing when you go through something like that, where everybody's like, it must be so hard for you because you lost your boss, or like you got to know this great man.
mhm,
And I'm like, no, I lost the guy whose button I buttoned when he couldn't get his top button done on his shirt. I lost the guy who I made sure had a blueberry muffin every morning for breakfast.
mhm,
I
mhm,
lost the guy who would call me at all hours of the evening asking for an idea. I lost the guy I could confide in. I lost my friend.
yeah,
And then
yeah,
you go through this like, because his voice ends up everywhere, right?
right,
I'll just walk down the street and there'll be a mural, and I'll just in my head I'll be like, oh come on, man, like
mhm, mhm,
um, or like you'll hear him on the radio or see him on TV, and I guess the thing is, I never see him captured as the person I remember. Always see him behind a podium or in a fancy room, and I never ever. When they do these documentaries and they don't capture who he is at all.
mhm,
It's
mhm,
like they made up a person and then they listed his resume.
right,
And you don't see the guy who liked to make jokes and throw jelly beans at you and drink cokes with grenadine when he wanted to celebrate. And that's the person I like to talk about. That's
yeah,
the guy I like to tell kids about,
yeah,
because otherwise he just seems so impossible to emulate. And he's not. This kid, he grew up poor.
mhm,
He went to public schools. He went to a seminary, got an associate's degree, worked in the kitchen, scrubbing pots and pans to pay for it. Any one of us could be like him,
yeah,
but we
yeah,
have to have the courage to try.
yeah, yeah. There's that posterized version, but of course the dovetail here is that there is a part of him that exists in March because you and Nate were there with him and worked with him and preserved that part of his story to live on too, which doesn't capture the whole person, but uh, more than the poster, certainly.
Well, and that's why, honestly, that's I remember having the conversation. The book. Everybody thinks they think about the book and they read it. If they haven't read it, they think the book ends with the signing of the Voting Rights Act, but it doesn't.
Hmm,
It
hmm.
ends with the congressman being like, "All right, we're gonna do your comic book idea. I think it's a good," and me being
Hmm,
like,
hmm.
"Really?" And like him and me being like, "They're gonna laugh at you," and he's like, "Ah, it's not the first time," you know.
Right, right. Yep,
And that it ends as it begins, which is like John Lewis in his house on inauguration day, putting on his slippers, like
yeah,
brushing his teeth, like, and people ask, why do you open the book like that? And you're like, because you have to show he's a human being.
right.
He lives in a house. He puts his shoes on one shoe at a time. He brushes his teeth. He takes a shower. He gets ready for his day. He misses calls on his phone and has voicemails, and everything that he is human.
Hmm. Because folks out there can make a difference too and do something too.
Yeah.
You don't wake up on a cloud.
Right.
Yeah,
Well, I appreciate this conversation.
absolutely. I appreciate your patience with me as I was signing back in. Uh, and looking forward to the work that's to come. I know it's been a healing process for you and sending all the good thoughts for continued healing. And, that's something that I don't think ever ends when you lose people that you love, but certainly you also get to be that testament to the people that they've been to.
Yeah. Well, I hope I can come visit you out in Watauga,
That would
and
be great.
we'll figure it out.
That would be great. I would love that. Absolutely.
Well, thanks, Jason, man.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much. And glad to talk again anytime.
Yeah, for sure. All right, man. You get some rest. It's late now.
Yep, yep. You do the same.
All right. We'll talk soon.
All right,
Thanks,
thanks.
man.
Bye.